good evening. I am Professor Julius Bailey. I'm a professor of philosophy here at Wittenberg University. I also chair our Justice, Law, and Public Policy program, as well as African Diaspora Studies. I am excited to have you here today. We're excited about this broadcast, and I want to hand it over to my wonderful co-host, Ms. Jasmine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine Evans. I'm a senior here at Wittenberg, and I'm a biology major, double minor in marine science and Africa and the Diaspora Studies. Thank you all for tuning in to our first installment of the Amplifying Whispers series. And thanks for joining the conversation today on the topic of witnessing history, social change, and our relationship to the past.
I mean, this conversation is extremely important for us to think about not just issues of race, but understand the relationship of what it means to be American, what it means to navigate our way through the American tapestry, all the different stories, all the conversations. And so what you're going to have tonight is a bit of oral history, right? You're going to have an understanding of how stories lend itself to understanding history. So I'm just excited. And to even kick this off, right, this whole series off, which actually is a 9-version series that begins today. And I'm excited for all my colleagues and staff at Wittenberg University. You're watching live right now. You're probably watching on Facebook or you're watching on Twitter. And if you are, thank you so much. But please share it, retweet it. Let everybody know what we're doing here at Wittenberg University. Again, we're trying to do the best that we can do to engage in conversation. So tonight, without further ado, tonight we have a wonderful conversation, as Jasmine told you, entitled Witnessing History, Social Change, and Our Relationship to the Past. And I'm just giddy to have two of my wonderful friends and colleagues to start us off and have this conversation along with an alum. And so who you'll have tonight, those of you who are alums, you would know Professor Rick Incravati, who is in our English department. You'll know Professor Kent Brooks, who is in our music department, and class of 17, Miss Lauren Instenez. And so we're excited about having them. And so sit back. After about a 10-second break, we will begin this show.
We are so glad to be here to start off this series, and we wanted to start by giving our heartfelt thank you to our colleague, Professor Julius Bailey, for a couple reasons. One, if you're in the room, you know just how much of his efforts are involved in putting this production on. He is orchestrating so much here in order to keep that conversation going. And that's the second reason we want to thank him, because he has just been such a rich catalyst for making sure that important issues are part of the conversations at Wittenberg University. So thank you, Julius, for all the work that you've done, past and present, and we look forward to the future as well. And we're so glad to be with you here today. I want to introduce Lauren Instenez, who's going to offer a quick acknowledgement of the land that we're on. Welcome back to Wittenberg, Lauren.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be virtually back with you guys. As Rick said, I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement. I'm currently in New York, and so I've been living and studying on the unceded land of the Lenape people. And you at Wittenberg, if you're on campus or in Springfield, are on the land of the Shawnee people, among some others. This land was violently colonized, and we should honor the struggle and effort it has taken for these groups to resist and rebuild through the sustained oppression that they have faced. I think this is important for us to acknowledge, even if we aren't specifically talking about Indigenous history tonight. As Kent and Rick will both mention later, if we are going to talk about fighting oppression in this country, really have to do it intersectionally. It's all linked. So that's all from me for right now, and I will see you guys at the end. Kent, I'm going to throw it back to you to start us off.
Thank you, Lauren. We appreciate your participation in this. And again, welcome, and thanks again to Julius. And I'd like to start off by just thinking about social change in this way by starting with a little personal story. This past June, in fact, it was the weekend of Juneteenth, I had the pleasure of going home to North Carolina, to Raleigh, where my sister lives, to be at my nephew Gavin's wedding. It was a joyous occasion, and I was hoping to be just another family member, but my nephew got me pegged to do the music, so I was actually the musician for the wedding. Regardless, it was a good time, and we all had a joyous time watching as family and friends came together to witness the event. After the wedding and back in the hotel room, I turned on the television, and my jaw dropped as I saw something, local breaking news in Raleigh. A group of people had gathered in the rain that evening in an area known as Moore Square. And this was just blocks away from the state capitol in Raleigh. They marched from Moore Square to the Capitol, and they toppled over 2 bronze Confederate statues from their 175-year-old monuments, and they dragged them down the streets of Raleigh and downtown. Again, I stood with my mouth open in the middle of the hotel room. I couldn't believe what was going on. I remember when I was around 5 years old, and part of our family's Sunday ritual after church was to jump into our big green Ford Fairlane. Some of you may not remember Ford Fairlanes. They were classic cars then. And we would make the 1-hour trip from our hometown of Oxford, North Carolina, down Highway 15 south, heading to Raleigh to return my big brother Larry to St. Augustine's University, where he studied music. And we'd stop by Krispy Kreme donuts because that was also part of our routine. And we would have to pass by those 2 huge statues. I remember them being as big, scary men. In fact, sometimes whenever we would walk downtown Raleigh, I remember nudging my mom and saying, let's cross the street, because I didn't want to deal with them. They were just too big and too scary. I didn't know that my childhood intuition would give me justification for my fears as I grew older and got to know the deeper purpose for those statues. Where I was reared, some saw those statues as celebration of heritage. For me, my parents, who grew up in the Depression age, children of the Depression, and for my grandmother, those statues were reminders to know your place in a particular social structure. These were some of the first lessons I learned. And tonight, we attempt to explore these lessons and recognize patterns of behavior that become codified within both conscious and unconscious interactions, and look at a few methodologies of oral history that seek to honor the experience and the storyteller and thoughtfully engage the listener.
Thank you, Ken. So that sets the tone for our conversation today. We're interested in history, our identities, and our commitments to social change. And one of the interesting things about this history is that we come to it from different positions. So my effort here is to try and make sense of how history has helped me, I think, as a white person, to be positioned to do some of the work that feels right and just to me, which is going to be a different approach to history than others might have, different experiences of that history. You're going to get a lot of borrowed wisdom from me here. I'm not a historian. As Professor Bailey shared, I'm in the English department. And I may give you one metaphor along the way for just to pay homage to my discipline. But history has helped me think about who I am. And so I'm going to offer wisdom that's from a personal perspective, and then give you a lot of borrowed knowledge that I've accumulated from others along the way. So one of my first bits of borrowed knowledge comes from a friend, Cherie Bridges Patrick, who is kind of a racial justice coach. She does tremendous work in Ohio. And I've been fortunate to be in some meetings with her where she starts the conversation in these words. Now, the words aren't hers. They're from Lila Watson. Lila Watson is an Indigenous activist in Australia. So this is coming from all sorts of oppressed experiences. And it goes this way. And this is not coming from me. This is the voice of an oppressed person committed to social justice. If you have come here to help me, she says, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. It's a powerful statement. It's been helpful to me. I'm just going to read it through one more time. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. I think why I hear those words so powerfully is that I do have that helping impulse. I do see a problem and I say, let's fix it. Let's address the inequities that we see in the world around us. But that quote reminds us that fixing it can be a matter of looking away from problems that may be more personal, problems that are closer to home, particularly as a white person who's interested in racial justice. So our work to improve the world around us might actually be perpetuating some of the problems that created that world unless we're cautious about how we go about that work. So motives do matter. That's another thing I hear in that quote. Why are we doing the work that we're doing? There are two big problems in the world around us. One of them is systemic racism. There are the economic figures that tell us about injustices. There are the incarceration rates that tell us we have a problem. But they're the interpersonal relationships. And we need to prepare ourselves to work alongside of those people who are calling for justice. So we carry with us our identities. I will go wherever I go as a white person. And that quote reminds me, I need to do the work of reminding myself what that means, because I won't be able to put that down. The racism that's around us is somehow something that I've contributed to, despite my best interests or my best intentions. So how do we recognize our complicity? It's not an easy thing to do. And here's where I want to bring in my metaphor for the day. I'm fond of riding my bike. I like getting on the bike paths around here and going down to Yellow Spring, particularly on a Saturday morning. And as I'm pedaling and pedaling and pedaling, there are some mornings where I think, man, I've got it going on. I've been practicing for a while. I've been working out. My legs must be strong. This feels good. I'm going at a good pace. I look down at my speedometer and it tells me it's not just your imagination. You're moving pretty fast. And then I'll get down to Yellow Springs and I get my water bottle out. And then it's time to head back home, and I get back on the path going the other way, and it's not too long before I realize the wind has been at my back the whole time. When I thought about what was making the day feel so perfect, the idea that wind was at my back didn't enter my head. It was all about how my efforts were helping me get to where I go. So that's an image that's been helpful to me. Some of us do have the wind at our backs. Some of us are benefiting from the forces that are around us, invisible forces. We may acknowledge that there's implicit bias in the world, but it's harder to feel that implicit bias as the wind that's helping some of us and the wind that's working against others. When we benefit from privileges, another thing this experience shows me is that our first explanation is often not somebody else is helping me along, or there's some inequity that is working in my favor. My first explanation is, I'm doing this. This is all about me. The other part of this frequent experience that I have to take home to myself is that I can learn this one Saturday. I'll be back on my bike the next Saturday and I've forgotten it. And the next time that wind is at my back, the same thoughts will enter my mind. Now, the poet Coleridge said, no metaphor runs on all four legs. In other words, the analogies kind of break down somewhere. And there's one way in which this analogy breaks down, and it's a powerful way. In terms of my whiteness, I never have to turn that bike around. I never have to go against the wind. I have to imagine what it feels like to have that wind in my face. But it's not like riding a bike where, as I'm going out, I'll have that advantage behind me. And then coming back, I'll be reminded that, oh, that's why I was doing so well. No, I just keep going on the same path. At least in the culture that we have, I will always be moving with that wind at my back. So that's part of the experience that teaches me, well, if I'm going to have to learn, it'll be invaluable for me to learn that my freedom is bound up in another person's liberation. It's going to be a hard lesson for someone who enjoys privilege. One other way of thinking about this work that I think many of us who enjoy privilege have to do is I encourage you to go to Straight No Chaser, Professor Bailey's podcast, and watch the whole interview with Father Michael Flager. It's terrific. But what comes to mind in the present moment for this this presentation is that he says, you got to be careful about being a flash activist. You feel that there's a cause, you want to move towards it, but you don't have the stamina, you don't have the staying power to keep at it. And that's helpful for me when I think about the role that history plays. So if I'm used to having the wind at my back, one, I need to learn to recognize that wind. I think history will play a role in that. And second, I need to have the stamina to continue doing that work over the long haul, to continue to feel that my liberation is bound up with another person's liberation. And so for me, that's been I think the advantage that I've taken away from learning about the history of this country, learning about the history of this community, learning about the history of institutions that I'm a part of, institutions like Wittenberg, institutions like Christ Episcopal Church, where I serve. Those histories teach me about the complexity of the place where I stand. The positions that I occupy are the result of some wind that's blown in directions that both help and impede. So learning about the places that we stand is the gift of history. We are on land. As Lauren got us started thinking about the violence that brought us here in the first place, that's part of that work, to think about the complexities of where we are and which way the wind has been blowing for a good long time. So some of the ways that we are shaped are certainly our national history, our local history, our institutional history, our religious history, our family histories. Our national history, of course, is as complex as we can imagine, and Kent has shared the story of watching the Confederate statues come down. I'll share just one experience of mine that has helped me think about our nation in the ways that I've received an understanding of our nation's past. I've grown up in a community that loved July 4th. July 4th was one of the big celebrations of the year. It's a big park downtown and the community would gather. Fireworks would go off. Festival was down there. But when did I learn about Juneteenth? I can place it. I can place when I learned about Juneteenth. I was at a wedding in Texas and I was standing in the circle where that was part of a racist joke. And that hits me in the stomach now to think about that. One, why do we celebrate the liberation of a country at a point when 30% of the population in the South was enslaved in 1776? Who's celebrating on that day? Or is there a way of at least celebrating July 4th that acknowledges we weren't all free? The energy in our country isn't around finding that way of celebrating. And Juneteenth is happily growing as a holiday, but it's not there yet. If we go back to that quote about the importance of feeling that our liberation is bound up together, it seems to be an index, the way that history is out there for us to digest and to think about how it tells us the story of the place that we occupy, but we're not there yet. And when we get there, it's helpful. When we do digest it, it gives us that stamina we need and helps us be accomplices in the social justice work. The local history, when I first moved to Springfield, I was aware of the north side, south side divisions. You can't be here too long without recognizing, okay, are you on the north side? Or are you on the south side? That becomes meaningful. And it's been in the years since then that I stumbled on a really terrific master's thesis by Darnell Carter. If anybody's interested in this, catch my email address at Wittenberg's webpage, send me an email. I will send you Darnell Carter's master's thesis. He wrote about the race riots in Springfield in 1904, 1906, And in 1921, actually next year, will be the 100th anniversary of the last big race riot in Springfield. Well, to understand North and South is one thing. You'll get a sense of the divisions in our community and people who identify as North Sider and South Sider, but the history behind that is remarkable and violent, and part of who we are now. And then we're broadcasting from Wittenberg. Wittenberg, that has really the remarkable story of the first African-American student admitted here in 1875. That's Broadwell Chin. And that is something worth celebrating. 15 years, or actually just a decade after the end of the Civil War. And we have Black students studying here. And the flip side of that is it was a long time before the second Black student arrived. And so that points to more of that complex history that we're a part of. And if we're going to do the work of social justice, understanding where we stand and how that history is part of our present is important stuff. So resources that are out there, again, I am not a historian. I am someone who can point you in the direction of some good poems. But as just a citizen of this country, things that have enriched me and that have stayed with me and have given me energy include Ta-Nehisi Coates' famous essay, The Case for Reparations. That's one of those that has just changed my thinking. The New York Times 1619 project, which is finding its way back in the headlines these days, but I encourage folks to look into that history. It's both written and there are podcasts that have been developed around it. And I'm going to point at Darnell Carter's master's thesis again, because it has certainly shaped the way I have thought about myself as a Springfielder and as someone who lives in a particular neighborhood in that history. So Kent has brought us to this idea that he has watched history change in the tearing down of the statues. I've watched that through different eyes, and I've had water in my eyes too, but for different reasons. And as a white person, I just want to encourage folks to, in addition to reading books like White Fragility and books like How to Be an Anti-Racist, which teach us about the dynamics around us, I encourage you to find the value of the stories that tell us about the places that we occupy, and let that be part of your whiteness, our whiteness, and let us aspire to be that kind of person who wants to work alongside of others for everyone's liberation. Now I'll pass the deliveries back to my friend Kent here, who has more reflections on history and our role in the world that we occupy.
Thank you so much. Blood Done Signed My Name. It's a 2004 multiple award-winning memoir penned by historian Dr. Timothy Tyson, a fellow North Carolinian who has joint appointments at Duke University and my alma mater, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This book was made into a 2010 movie, and that stars Ricky Schroeder. And the title of the book refers to an African-American congregational song. And I've heard it many times growing up at my little small United Holiness church. My mom used to sing it. My grandmother used to sing it. It says, "Oh, the blood has signed my name." And it speaks of the eschatological theme embedded in many slave narratives. The theme runs familiar in both sorrow songs, like "Soon I Will Be Done with the Trouble of This World," and in Jubilee songs, like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." They promise the relief from hardships and human degradation, either through legislation or divine transformation, i.e. death. This belief is the forerunner to a specific type of liberation theology that gives birth to the idea of one's name being written or signed in the Lamb's Book of Life, after having endured a mortal life of tribulations. Thus it is the cross, the gift of the cross and resurrection, that has assured the signing of one's name. In other words, if you don't get your freedom here on earth, you'll find it in heaven. The slaves had it, and it's an idea that carries forth today. In his book, Dr. Tyson tells the story of growing up as a young man, the son of a Methodist preacher, in tiny Oxford, North Carolina, my hometown. and watching racial discrimination persist years after the federal laws were enacted to ensure civil rights. The various social themes of the book are connected to the killing of a young veteran named Henry Merrill, the eventual acquittal of his murderers by an all-white male jury, and the effects of those decisions had on an entire city. On May 11, 1970, Henry Merrill finished a card game with some friends and headed to a local store to get a Coca-Cola. While he was there, Robert Till, the store owner, had an 18-year-old son, and his son, named Larry, accused Merrill of disrespecting the son's wife, named Judy. Robert Till and his stepson, Roger Oakley, rushed into their store and retrieved their guns. The horrible events of that evening ended with onlookers witnessing Robert, Larry Till, and Oakley all beating Merrill and shooting him multiple times, eventually concluding with a fatal shot to the head. On the day of Henry Merrill's funeral, there was a protest march from his graveside to a Confederate monument at the county courthouse in downtown Oxford, where various people spoke out about the killing. As stated, these men were acquitted, and this set off a literal firestorm as businesses were set aflame and the social unrest gained national attention. When I moved to Ohio 10 years ago, I taught music for Dayton Public Schools my first year, and I remember teaching a section on freedom songs of the civil rights era. In an attempt to illustrate to my fifth graders that we weren't that far removed from that period I spoke of, I shared with them that I was the first African-American baby born in my hospital in Oxford, North Carolina. One young man raised his hand with haste, and he had a puzzled expression on his face. It almost looked like pain. And I recognized him, and he bellowed, Mr. Brooks, how old are you? After I reminded him that we were going to discuss civil rights era and not the Civil War era, it caused me to think about lessons and patterns that we see. Even many of the freedom songs of the 1960s were repurposed code songs and sorrow songs and jubilee songs of the slave South. Keep Your Hand on the Plow, an old work song performed behind a mule in the cotton fields, became Keep Your Eye on the Prize. And it was performed at Millennium Freedom March. Its new purpose was to inspire. These songs were part of a minority culture's response to familiar patterns that they were starting to see. Although slavery had been abolished, Jim Crow had become a familiar feel. A Confederate statue in Oxford, North Carolina in 1970 was arguably one of the most solid codifications of what Black people needed to know to stay in their place. Henry Merrill's murder was proof. There was even a Confederate statue that guarded the front yard of the town's public library. I remember my mom taking me to get my first library card. I was about 5 years old, and I remember having to walk past that monstrosity. I had a brief flashback of the two Confederate soldiers in the state capitol. I shrugged it off and kept going. I find it interesting that at 6 years old, I was entering a building that would unlock my academic curiosity, thereby endowing me with the power to overcome the mental enslavement represented by that very statue. Here's a side note. A month after my nephew's wedding that I mentioned earlier, I discovered that that statue too had been taken down. Black people in Oxford, fortunately, did not take Henry Merrill's death lying down. They marched all the way from Oxford to the state capitol in Raleigh. When this didn't work, the local NAACP staged an 18-month boycott of all the white-owned businesses. This nearly brought the town of 10,000 people to an economic crash. Full integration was finally achieved. I was a toddler when this happened, so obviously I don't remember it, but I do remember family members talking about it. And I do know the Merrill family very well. In fact, when I was a teenager, I was the organist for the family's church on third Sundays. But when I was 10, I remember my dad having the talk with me. For those who don't know what the talk is, it's not the talk about how babies are made. In this context, it's the discussion of a parent of color with his or her child, nephew, niece, or grandchild about how to navigate life as part of a minority culture. The talk can happen anytime the parent figure feels the child is ready, or it can be situation dependent. For me, the context was the murder of Henry Merrill. Although the incident happened years before, Mom and Dad recalled every gruesome detail to impress upon me the enormity of being a young Black man in the South. They told me not to incite fear, but to make me wise and to keep me alive. As I grew older, I began to recognize patterns. I was never to go into any department store alone. I was always to be with my sister or an older cousin. Because the police in the Merrill case were dubious at best, in fact, it was later proven that some of them were on the take. I was told to cross the street if I ever encountered them alone. Mistaken identity was commonplace. As I got older, I was taught to notice when I'm being watched. When I began to drive, I was taught what to say, where to place my hands, where to have my wallet in place so it wouldn't be mistaken as a gun. Although at 5 years old, I could read at a 5th grade level, and I was a renowned academic throughout high school and college, I remember my dad saying these words to me, and he had so many sayings. He said, "Son, because of who you are, sometimes you're going to have to work twice as hard just to be half as good." All these nuggets and more I hold in my head today. And regarding Dr. Tyson, a group started in his own church because his father sympathized with the Black population of the town, ran him and his family out of Oxford. Henry Merrill's death was not in vain, though. What happened in my hometown mobilized other protests in other towns and actions in North Carolina, bringing about a rapid change after the integration holdout post-1964. So today I'm starting to recognize patterns again. I'm noticing legislation that's either being put in place or even dismantled that not only places people of color at disadvantages, but literally kills them. With Henry Merrill, the white jury of 12's agenda wasn't hidden. They were picked with purpose because Robert Till, the store owner, had influence in the town. Today's patterns are attempting to be more nuanced, but some aren't nuanced and they don't even care to be. I had a racial slur hurled at me 3 times the first month I moved here 10 years ago. And even just last month, I took a Sunday drive out in the county because after church, sometimes I just like to get in my car and drive. It's soothing to me. And as I was heading back into town, I noticed one house that they were displaying their national pride with a huge flag. And I thought, oh, how nice. What was interesting and what really caught my eye was an equally large Confederate flag hanging beside it. I thought, I wonder if this person knows that Ohio wasn't even part of the Confederacy. As I continued to drive to the safety of my home, thankful that I hadn't broken down in that neighborhood. I can't even tell you the number of times I've been followed in a store, different stores in Springfield and Dayton, because the proprietor or the manager thought I was going to steal something. In one case, I even had 2 people watching me at the same time. It should be shocking to me, but my dad had warned me about this 40 years ago. Sadly, I've become comfortable with how it feels, and I've become comfortable with people underestimating me, only to be surprised when I equal or surpass them in their expectations. Because of these patterns I'm seeing again, I worry about my nephew. That same nephew who got married, he's a young guy in his mid-20s, college educated, newly married professional. And a misidentification can mean the difference, literally, between life and death for him. His accomplishments and attributes won't save him. But more importantly, what if my nephew weren't all those things? Who becomes the arbiter of mercy? This was the reality for Henry Merrill. It was the reality for George Floyd. And sadly, it's a pattern that is still playing out today. We'll now turn this part of our discussion over to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kent. Your stories just are incredible. And I'm excited to be joining with you guys. We're going to test out some tech stuff. I think I have a PowerPoint that's going to maybe pop up in a minute. All right, well, I'll start and then we'll see if that comes into play. So I'm going to talk with you guys a little bit about oral history and how I think that it can be a great tool for us to use to reshape the history of our country to include a lot of what Kent and Rick have been talking about. I'm going to start off with throwing it back to acknowledging that oral history has its roots in Indigenous tradition. But like many other things, it was appropriated by academia and then used to document the stories of the privileged and the powerful. So what is oral history? The current mainstream practice of oral history has strayed pretty far from its Indigenous roots, but the goal has stayed somewhat similar, and that is to preserve history through documenting lived experience. And this can look like a lot of different forms. The more academic version is interviews with an interviewer and a narrator and some sort of recording device. But then it can also look like Kent's family passing down stories and that generational knowledge that he was talking about. More recently, the practice has started the process of recentering itself to focus on documenting the stories of those who are traditionally left out of or purposely removed from the historical record. And this is where we can use oral history for social justice and how that comes into play. So as Rick mentioned, we traditionally learn only one version of history, especially if you're white and growing up in a predominantly white area. And that is very often people that have held the most power. So very straight, very white, very male in our country. But when we start to introduce alternative narratives into that history, we're able to highlight injustice and restructure power. Right now, I'm listening to a really great podcast, and I'm going to plug How to Citizen with Bartunde Thurston. And in it, they talk a lot about power and how to exercise your own power in this country. One thing that's mentioned is that those in power often use storytelling to justify that power. So I see oral history as a way for us to tell a new story, one that moves the power out of the hands of the oppressors and into the hands of those who are organizing and resisting and trying to heal our communities. However, we really need to be careful about how we go about this so that we don't accidentally perpetuate this cycle of oppression and harm. And now I really need my PowerPoint. So is someone going to be able to do that? All right, let's see if I can share it. Kent and Rick, can you guys hear me still? Oh, they're coming. All right, let's see if I can. Can someone give me a thumbs up if I should try to share my screen instead? Okay, we're gonna try to share it then. Okay. Great. Okay, great. Okay, so we can jump forward to the third slide. Wonderful, thank you so much. Okay, so this is a really great infographic that I saw. And it was shared by No White Saviors, which is an awesome Instagram account that I'm also going to plug. And it is on what it means to do ethical storytelling. And I just think it perfectly encapsulates what we should think about when we collect and publish stories, no matter what form we're using. So it could be oral history, it could be film, photography, or just posting on social media. So the quote on the side says, like money, storytelling is currency. Storytelling is central to human cognition and communication. We tell stories to raise awareness about complex issues, to fundraise, or simply share experiences. Storytelling is indeed the most effective way to walk in someone else's shoes, as storytelling certainly makes us aware of our place in the hierarchy of privilege. Storytelling is really about influence and power in communication. The power to define, give meaning, to exclude or include. Storytelling has the capacity to bring about change. With this power comes a substantial responsibility of telling stories ethically. And the graphic tells us that the first rule of ethical storytelling is that we need to throw away the idea that you are a voice for the voiceless. There are people without access, those who are unheard or ignored, but no one is voiceless just because you're not listening. I love this graphic because this is extremely important, especially when you are an outsider of any group who will be the person doing an interview or sharing a story that isn't yours. One of the biggest problems that continually happens is when people come in with an idea of what stories they want to hear instead of the stories that the community wants to tell. This can take away agency from the community and often flatten stories into one dimension, focusing on trauma of the community instead of resistance or beauty. There are a lot of other ways too that agency and power can be taken away from narrators if we aren't careful, but we don't have time to go into all of those. And I'm also not the perfect oral historian. There's lots of things constantly changing, and our practice keeps changing. But if you are a storyteller or are interested in doing that kind of work, I would focus on protecting the agency and the rights of the people that you're working with. And if you want to look into oral histories, do's and don'ts, the Oral History Association has a best practices list that you can look at. It's definitely incomplete, but you can start there. So now we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So that's mostly my spiel, but I wanted to give you an example of the type of stories that come out of doing oral history right in your community and how relevant those stories can be. This is a story from an interview I did with Nikki Mitchell, who is a lifelong resident of Springfield. I'm sure many of you know her because she is and always has been a very outspoken advocate for many social justice causes in Springfield. But one thing I think is always really interesting to ask people who do such important work is how they got there, and what made them interested in that or pushed them into those kind of goals. So in this clip, Linky shares one of the events that she thinks led her on the path to social justice. So let's play it here.
And that's when as I was growing up, I got real involved in social justice and doing things at the school and starting things up and trying to connect such a rivalry of schools because of sports and also race and economic stuff. And so we built some bridges. We had a group that met on Sundays that was a mix of the schools. We met at the school and talked about race. Was there a reason that started, or was it just growing tensions? It was growing tensions, and there was a young man that I knew that got killed at the high school, not at Catholic Central, but at the high school. And he got stabbed, and the guy got off, and the guy that was killed was Ralph Stinnett, and I knew him. And I remember going to school the next day and having to be sent home because somebody said something, and I went off, and then kind of grabbed me up, and I wasn't in trouble. He just listened. I was mad and hurt. It's not right. So after that, I and some other people started just pulling people together, and talking. Because our football games, we couldn't even play at our schools. They played at Wittenberg. South and North football games were like, we had to play on a neutral ground because it was that bad. And it was race, and it was money. And so it was just a lot of, just all that hate, all that fighting and stuff. There was a lot of us that were tired of it. So we just started trying to build some bridges. And I was so glad to be part of that, be part of starting that up. And so that's probably why I do what I do.
So many people in Springfield remember that event, but held up against the conversation that's going on in our country right now, this story plays an important role in revealing those patterns that Kent was talking about. So while this is a story of tragedy and racism and horrible injustice, it's also a story of resistance and organizing and bridge building, as Lindsay said. So this pattern of resistance, sometimes it's harder for us to find because our country hasn't been the most receptive to those kinds of changes. But it's important that we lift up those stories, and because we can use the stories to break the patterns that harm us, and we can use other stories to build off of those patterns of resistance that keep us fighting and building bridges. So this last slide that's up is just some resources that I've kind of mentioned throughout. The first resource is the map of the Native territories if you kind of want to check out what land you're on, and then just other oral history projects that are really relevant to this conversation and great stories to support. Yeah, if you want to jot those down and check any of those out, that's my spiel. We'll throw it back to Kent and Rick to close us out, or
It's great to have her do all the learning that she's doing out there and then bring it back to her alma mater here in Springfield, and to tell stories about Springfield in the process. Hearing that voice, bring that past forward to us is powerful. So thank you for the work that you do. I think we're ready. We have a couple of student responders who have been listening carefully to our deliveries, and we're happy to take questions.
Before our student responder comes in, we do have one question, and it was to Professor Brooks.
Yes.
What would you say is the best way for a student to understand the current statute debate? And I guess what they're saying is that how should a student understand the pro and con of whether to tear down statues or not?
I would say, and is to start with, I think education is the base, should be the basis of everything. Get knowledge, because I think so much of what we see played out, especially in a 24-hour news cycle, a lot of what we see played out is based on quite a bit of theater and quite a bit of emotions. I would say start out and get history. Just don't go on a bunch of sound bites. I say this jokingly sometimes, and I've said this kind of in the heat of a moment. I do admit I failed in that myself, but pick up an 8th grade civics book and read. But get credible information, get credible sources, read for yourself, and just don't get things off the internet based on opinion. Don't read opinion pieces, read credible sources of information so that you can get your facts, and then form your opinions based on solid information, and then go from there.
We had one more question. This is to Lauren. Lauren, can you hear us? So Lauren, the question was, Professor Incavati said you're at Columbia. Are you in graduate school now, or what are you doing now?
yes, I am finishing up my master's in oral history at Columbia right now. That's it. I'm in New York. So be here
All
for
right. So thank you, Professor Cavati. Thank you, Professor Brooks. And thank you, Lauren and Stenez, for your wonderful presentation. As a part of this series, we have a student who's going to give a student response, student to student, just talking about the issues that you talked about tonight from the student perspective. And so for today's show, we have senior philosophy and political science major, William Applegate.
Woohoo.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Bailey, for that great introduction, and I'd like to thank my fellow presenters for what they shared and the ideas they wanted to advance publicly to us. The aspect of storytelling is kind of what I want to stick with now. When Lauren was talking about what an ethical storyteller means, it reminded me of a quote that I read in some book that I never finished because it wasn't that good. But the point is, the quote was talking about the humanities and history, and it said, well, everything, history, philosophy, English, poetry, music, all of it's rhetoric. Regardless of what the actual objects of discussion are, whether it be statues, policy, anything, the only way people will experience it is based on how they're communicated it. Very few people can just, whenever they need to debate about whether a statue needs to stay up, a policy is going to be good, or anything like that, can go directly to the place or the people involved and talk to them directly. And that's a problem that we have to deal with. And storytelling can help us with that. There's been a lot of controversy recently with the 1619 Project from the New York Times, talking about when chattel slavery hit the colonies. And on the Hill and Capitol, there's been a lot of, right now, like Trump Republicans debasing it and calling it fake news, fake history, whatever. And it seems to me there's an idea that including the parts of history that you don't like somehow is dishonest to the parts that you do. And that doesn't make too much sense to me. And I don't think it makes too much sense to anybody who's taken a class or read a book or watched a TV show where pros and cons had to be weighed. I don't think anyone who's actively participating in something, actually in a political movement or anything like that, thinks they're doing evil. I think they think they're making the world, regardless of who they include in that world, they're going to make the world a better place if they succeed. Of course, some people get involved with money and things like that, or enriching themselves, but there still seems to be some implicit belief that even doing that makes the world somewhat better. And I think that idea can be dangerous when we start excluding people from that world. These debates about what constitutes American history seem, there's solutions, people who put these forward, like people who are against 1619 Project, and just discussions of what also happens and what also happened in America outside of what we were told about Manifest Destiny and constitutional conventions and things like that. They want to neglect a large part of what makes us us, for good and bad, and they want to remove parts of our history that we can definitely learn from. I'm sure we all have relatives, ancestors, friends, and family, acquaintances, people that we know, where we are proud to have some of them in our lives, and some of them we wish weren't there. Acknowledging the negative parts of our lives and our history doesn't make us any less us. It just allows us to learn more about how we can become who we want to be. So ethical storytelling or ethical framing of history, social issues, whatever, if you don't acknowledge what actually affects at least 30% of the population on a daily basis, I don't exactly think you're addressing problems that will benefit all Americans. Things like racism, sexism, things that exclude people based on irrational premises and arguments hurt everybody involved, not just people who are excluded. By taking down Confederate monuments or fighting against racism, it doesn't. It would improve the lives of the racist too. If we believe that justice is something that makes everybody better, then everybody who is unjust who becomes just has their life improved. Yeah, I'd like to thank Dr. Bailey and my fellow presenters for this opportunity and the ability to respond to the students. And I'm looking forward to the next conversation in these series down the road. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Webby, for your response. We're going to ask now Professor Incarvati and Professor Brooks to close us out.
Okay. I want to thank Webby for his response. I also want to thank Jasmine for engaging us and being part of this process, and just for the opportunity to learn from each other as we talk about the past. That idea that that justice makes us all better is something we have to sell to each other. You know, because the history where we tell all the stories is complex, there's a burden there. We're hearing things that make us uncomfortable. We may not be inclined to go, but I think what Webby's saying about holding out that idea of a just future that makes it worth the work may be one of the tickets to making this all fall into place. So just want to thank again Professor Bailey and our friend Lauren Extendis for being part of this, and for Professor Brooks.
Just want to say thanks for the opportunity to all involved. Professor Bailey for your vision and all of this, to our technical crew, all of our students. I think we have just some of the brightest students here at Wittenberg. We are so proud of them. They make us proud, and it is a pleasure to serve here at Wittenberg, our students and our colleagues. It's great to keep conversations going. I think one of the reasons why this is so important, what Professor Bailey is doing, is because conversations help us to understand each other, and it forms community. Language is that thing that's the base of what helps us get to know each other. And storytelling is one of those building blocks formed by language. So thank you for what you're doing, and I look forward to the other 8 parts of this series. I think it's going to be exciting. Thank you for honoring us to start this off. So we appreciate it. So good night to everyone, and see you next time.